Hey everyone, in today's video we show that Sam Harris's conception of evil is essentially standing on air. This is part 2 of my 2-part reaction series to Jordan Peterson confronting Sam Harris on his morality. So if you want to check that out, look at my earlier video. But with that, let's get right into it. Point out to everybody, just for the record, is that there's no such thing as a moral system that's purely rational. At some point, you always have to make an assumption based on faith or for the purposes of practicality somewhere. Somewhere in any moral system, there will be something that you cannot justify logically, rationally, or scientifically. And that's true for everybody, including Sam Harris. So just so nobody's under any illusions about that.
That's universally true.
Well, it's true for the requisite mind.
Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, doesn't matter.
Okay, but evil. So yes, I'm not telling you that you should purge the word evil from your vocabulary. I use the word all the time, and I think it's useful. It's a motivating word. I'm just saying that we can understand this continuum of good and bad, or positive and negative, in ways that don't use certainly don't use the Judeo-Christian framework for valuing these things. Because if you take the Buddhist framework and map it onto this continuum, you don't get good and evil. You get essentially wisdom and ignorance. Evil is ignorance of all the well-being you and others would experience if you behaved another way. Right, that's the Buddha's game, and
yeah, I mean, again, it's a very similar thing. It's just ignorance of the good, basically, and the goodness and the worthiness of pursuing the good. Yeah, interesting, different way of thinking about it.
Or even within Hinduism, and this connects to your love of stories. You take the Hindu text, the Ramayana, which is just a foundation. It's doing the work that the Bible is doing for Jews and Christians. In that the worst guy in the Ramayana, the 10-headed demon Ravana, the prototypically evil person, is at bottom really not a bad guy. He's a great sage who's just, in a bad mood, essentially, right?
I mean, Christianity believes this too, by the way. I mean, Judeo-Christian ethics say the same thing. They say that man is made in the image of God and everybody is ultimately redeemable if they seek the light, if they accept Christ. And whether or not you mean that literally or metaphorically, it doesn't matter. It's the same idea, that while human beings are inherently predisposed to sin, and while they sin a lot, there's nothing in them there's nothing about them that is sinful so inherently it cannot be escaped, because again, made in the image of God. And that if you stop being ignorant in the Buddhist conception, if you start being wise, if you turn away from evil and sin in the Christian conception and start moving towards the good, then yeah, you can be a better person. But the fact that redemption is always possible or always exists, or the fact that sin comes from a lack of knowing God, a lack of knowing the good, a lack of wisdom, that doesn't make the category not exist at all, which I know Harris just said, but he said this, but the way he's arguing really seems to be arguing that it shouldn't exist theoretically, even if he's willing to use the word in a pragmatic way. So again, just because the category is always able to be escaped if you're redeemed, or even if you're in the category because of biological reasons, the category still exists. We're still connecting your actions to a particular description. So it's, again, I don't. It's interesting that all of these different religions have such massive capacity for forgiveness. It's a pretty revolutionary idea, but you're being forgiven for something, is the long and short of it, and that something is for being evil, or doing evil things. So yeah,
he was obscured by ignorance. And so it is in the Buddhist canon. The Buddha meets a serial killer who is wearing a garland of human fingers around his neck, named Angulimala, but he was just one conversation away from being fully enlightened, right? I mean, he was like, it's a different picture of possibility. I'm not saying one is right or wrong.
Christians believe this too.
About that. I'm challenging your claim that there's something so prescient and useful and durable about the Judeo-Christian framework.
I wasn't making that claim.
We're stuck with it for all time.
Well, I wasn't making that claim. I was making the claim that in the moral landscape, you laid out a distinction between the bad life and...
Yeah, it is true. Harris kind of like went off on his own thing there after interrupting Peterson. So I am curious to see where he tries to go with this. The video is named that Peterson confronts Harris anyway, so I'm expecting him to get a lick in here.
The good life, forget about good and evil, the bad life and the good life, hell and heaven, the bad life and the good life, and that distinction was not only factual but universal. And so
it's not factual. Definitionally exists. It's not factual.
It's universal given the right mind. So we could imagine a mind. I mean, this is an example.
Okay, universal in a right mind.
But we could.
Yeah, Harris keeps interrupting Peterson here. I mean, I suppose it's for the purposes of clarification, but still, it is. I am curious just to hear what Peterson's point is at this point.
We could create circumstances that seem perverse to us that we would recoil from. You could create a universe of perfectly matched sadists and masochists, say, right? So you have the people who are real sadists who, in our world, would be terrible actors.
Here's another thing. What do you mean by right mind, Sam? I mean, how do you determine that exactly? Like, is a psychopath or a sadist really demonstrably off from what is good or healthy? I mean, right now, you would consider a lot of psychological disorders are defined by their impact on your ability to function in the current world, but you could very easily make the argument that it's not the problem with the person. You can make the argument it's the problem with the way the culture is set up, and that maybe you should have the perfectly matched sadist and masochist thing. I don't believe this. Sam doesn't believe this, but when you're in categories, like when you walk in circles like Sam does, of just being in these atheistic, materialistic, relativistic things where there is no real objective standards of good and bad, when you throw about terms like right mind, you got to be careful. Like somebody who believes in objective morality, who is more of a religious person, can throw around terms like right mind a lot more casually than somebody in Harris's shoes can. To my mind, anyway. I think. I mean, I know I just complain about him interrupting too much, but I don't know if he can get away with that so easily as he seems to want to.
But in their world, they're surrounded by people who want to be mistreated. Now, again,
if you're a real sadist, you never mistreat a masochist.
Also, mistreated by what metric? Because in that world, that's exactly what they want. By the way, that's actually Peterson's point there. Again, like, it's like baked into his language is his moral assumptions here. And I mean, I like his moral assumptions. I think those moral assumptions are good, but they're absolutely assumptions, especially in that fictional universe he just created.
Masochist when he asks
well,
you to.
Okay, well, these are granted. I'm not.
Use of humor is good by Peterson. There is getting a little heated.
Sorry,
I'm not sure the human categories even exist.
Couldn't resist.
But in undoubtedly we could create something like an artificial intelligence that could be paired this way, and that would be weird. But in my framework, it is a conceivable space of equivalent well-being, and it's not matched at all to our space, right? But it's if in fact we could inspect the conscious minds of all parties participating in that, it is not obviously absurd, in my view, to say that they are just as happy as we are in this conversation. In fact, some moments in this conversation, I would say that they might be happier.
Well, yes, they would be just as happy under Harris's perception, and I think that this is the problem for him, right? Because in the moral landscape, according to Peterson anyway, he assumes people in their right mind for some reason. It's not exactly clear why, because he just admitted that people in that strange universe would have just as much subjective happiness, the utilitarian well-being, that kind of idea. So it's not really clear why you would assume people in their right minds when you're laying out the strategy for the good life versus the bad life. Again, like, there's a lot of a priori assumptions in here that he just kind of makes and thinks are just okay to make. And again, this is the problem with moral relativism is at least the religious people, when they say that they have moral presuppositions, they say that those are true and eternally true, and very real. And, you know, when you talk to somebody like Harris or to any other relativist, I actually had a show with Captain Jack recently about this, and you say, okay, I presuppose this, and they're going to say, why? And it's like, well, because it's useful, but I realize that it's arbitrary and any other presupposition is just as valid in reality. Well, then you're really taking the wind out of the sails of your own argument, at least, there, right? At least religious people, even if you want to say that the notion of objective reality is just as arbitrary, at least they're not self-defeating. So, there's that. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that reaction video. If you did, drop a like and please consider subscribing to see more. If you didn't, tell me why. I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. I want to have these conversations. If you want to see the rest of my content or explore the broader Pangburn universe that I'm a part of, click one of the buttons that should be floating around my head right about now. And as always, I hope to see you all out there engaging in the war of ideas.